Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin is Team Ninja's latest, a fast-paced action game that serves as a prequel to the original Final Fantasy. Early reports suggest that we aren't looking at a stunner, but as a new full-price Final Fantasy adventure, surely there must be some redeeming qualities here. Stranger of Paradise hit the scene with a surprise announcement and demo drop at Square-Enix's E3 2021 presentation. Early reactions were mixed, with many complaining of poor performance, bad image quality, and dated-looking graphics. Like all early demos, that initial showing represented just a small slice of the game with plenty of development still to come, so it's worth taking a look at this title with fresh eyes. Stranger of Paradise comes after Team Ninja's excellent Nioh games, and appears to be running on a version of the same engine. Nioh was a good-looking game, but it wasn't exactly known for its technical sophistication, and this effort seems to have fallen behind some of the standards set by that title and its 2020 sequel. The root of many of the problems here is the relatively dated approach to rendering tech. Most modern titles use a mix of techniques to approximate the way light behaves as it interacts with different materials. Light bounce, for instance, is typically simulated with global illumination systems, and surface qualities are simulated by using additional values like albedo, reflectance, and roughness in lighting calculations, also known as physically based rendering. Stranger of Paradise doesn't seem to have implementations of either of these systems, or if they are there, they aren't especially strong implementations. Just look at the ground here, for instance. The extremely bright light from the sun has seemingly zero contribution to the lighting in the shadowed areas. Or this indoor light. Notice how the light bleeds through the wall and causes a lot of specular glow. The general lighting model seems to be based on technology that would be at home in a 7th generation console game. The visual design seems to have taken some cues from 7th gen games as well. Aggressive specular and harsh color grading are the name of the game here. It looks quite a bit like some Unreal Engine 3 titles, from the mid-360 PS3 era. Unfortunately, image quality isn't far from some of those games, although we'll touch on that later. Some of the post-processing work doesn't really hold up well either. Stranger of Paradise has some of the ugliest, low-resolution screen space reflections I've seen in a console title. They have very little detail and suffer from a lot of shimmering in motion, though at least they are culled fairly aggressively so they don't cause as much artifacting as in last summer's demo. A strong camera motion blur is in effect here, but it doesn't look all that great. Each object is blurred individually, and the blurred area doesn't extend past the object geometry, leaving strong silhouettes. Lastly, brightness levels also tend to vary heavily from zone to zone. Playing on the default brightness settings, the first few missions look properly exposed for the most part, but this area a few hours into the game was extremely bright and blown out. The sunlight here is just eye-searingly bright, and turns highlighted regions, like the ground, to almost pure white. So is there anything that does work? Model detail is actually reasonably high, on PS5 and Series X at least. There's a fair bit of geometric density in the indoor environments in particular. Texture detail doesn't hold up quite as well, and outdoor areas tend to look a bit garish at times because of the lighting, but indoor areas can be quite heavily ornamented. A lot of care has been put into the underlying artwork, at least in some areas. This early zone has sort of a skeletal motif, for instance, with bony protrusions lining this stone walkway. Perhaps a half dozen hours or so into the game, you'll find yourself in this crystalline palace mission, which has a consistent theme and a striking look as well, although it does have some awful issues with specular aliasing. There are plenty of areas that do look rather drab, but there are some that look rather memorable. Finally, most of the incidental objects, barrels, tables, pots, and other items, are destructible, and satisfyingly disintegrate as you hit them. Larger objects like pillars can sometimes be destroyed as well, and there are some good-looking pre-calculated destruction animations and cutscenes. Stranger of Paradise is a dated and inconsistent-looking game, but not fundamentally a bad-looking one. There is some appealing art on display here, and as long as you temper your expectations, there is something to appreciate. Unfortunately, Stranger of Paradise's image quality makes that prospect a lot more challenging. There are 2 modes on each current-gen console, favor resolution and favor performance. There isn't that much difference between these modes, however, as both appear to target similar resolutions, albeit with a wider resolution range in the performance modes. PS5 and Series X seem to target 4K in both of their modes, with Series S targeting 1080p. All consoles seem to be using some dynamic res at times. Actual image quality is a bit questionable, however, as the game uses a collection of techniques to boost image quality but aren't especially effective. For starters, there's no TAA, so the image is very unstable and messy. The assets and artwork are relatively detailed and have strong specular elements as discussed before, so there's a ton of shimmer in gameplay. There does seem to be some form of anti-aliasing in effect, possibly a post-process AA, although coverage isn't great. Shimmer is all over the place and many edges receive no AA treatment. Secondly, a checkerboarding technique seems to be in effect on the premium machines. There are some telltale checkerboard artifacts showing fast camera movement, as well as oddities with certain geometric edges and with transparent elements like hair. A checkerboard solution was in place for Neo 2 on PS4 Pro, and this implementation is similarly not very impressive. Texture detail in particular is quite poor. Finally, it appears there's something strange going on with image scaling. The game almost looks like it's using nearest neighbor scaling, with uneven geometric edges. I suspect this is actually an artifact of the checkerboarding process, however, as the Series S version doesn't exhibit this problem. As a result, edge treatment paradoxically often looks better on the Series S than on the premium machines, despite the much lower rendering resolution. Usually you have to closely examine a modern game to spot aliasing or temporal flaws. Not so with Stranger of Paradise. Image quality is quite poor here, and the 4K output on the premium machines looks particularly messy. So is there anything else that differentiates the platforms? Unfortunately, there's a lot to discuss here. Stranger of Paradise's model and texture details have been sharply reduced on Series S. Most environmental detail has been radically simplified relative to the premium machines. Environmental detail isn't exactly stellar on PS5 and Series X, but on Series S, models have a fraction of the geometric detail and texture resolution. It's hard to overstate how different the game looks on Series S. It often looks like a PS3 or 360 rendition of a last-gen game. Some of the textures wouldn't look out of place in a PS2 title. Just take a look at this pillar. Series S is using a much simpler mesh, without any of the sloped shingles on Series X, nor the properly rounded off cylinders. Texture-wise, it looks like a blurry mess, with individual ridges just barely discernible and most of the normal map detail gone. It has been dramatically simplified, and not in a very artful way. It looks sort of like an algorithmically decimated asset that might be used for a distant LOD. This lamppost looks perfectly fine on Series X. The lamp has skeletal, knuckle-like ridges, with slits that let out light, like gaps in a leg bone. There is some interesting art here, and the tech, while unexceptional, at least gives the artist enough fidelity to play with to make it work. Series S? Well, see for yourself. Most of the detail and the artistic intent behind it is gone. Obviously, the Series S has a deficit in memory. 10GB of RAM are available on Series S, 6GB less than PS5 and Series X. But this level of asset quality is inexplicable and absolutely unacceptable in a current-gen game. I've never seen anything like it on Series S. Some of the cutscenes have been strangely altered on Series S. The expected downgrades do pop up here. Texture detail is much lower, for instance. The differences in scene lighting are very odd, however. This cinematic is much brighter on Series S, with much stronger bloom. Screen space reflections are also absent here in the cinematic on Series S, despite being present in the gameplay that immediately follows. Perhaps the strangest difference between the platforms, however, is the general absence of ambient occlusion on Xbox Series X and S. PS5 has a strong and pretty good ambient occlusion effect, whereas on Series X and S, the ambient occlusion is much more limited in some scenes, and at other times seems entirely absent. As it stands, Stranger of Paradise looks strangely flat and simple on Microsoft's current-gen machines.
All I care about is seeing chaos dead. I need to. It's not a hope or a dream. It's like a hunger, a thirst.
So how does Stranger of Paradise perform? Unfortunately, there are a lot of problems here as well. On PS5, both visual modes target 60 frames per second, but neither does an especially good job of achieving it. The performance mode frequently dips into the low 50s during typical gameplay. Most combat encounters incur FPS drops of some form or another, with finishing moves the worst culprits. To make matters worse, there are sporadic multi-frame hitches during traversal, possibly related to asset streaming. Resolution mode typically operates with a 10 FPS deficit relative to performance mode. 50 to 60 FPS is common in traversal, with 40 to 50 FPS the typical readout in combat, and large hitches are still somewhat common. It doesn't feel qualitatively different from performance mode, but it does feel noticeably less stable. As an aside, real-time cutscenes run at 30 FPS on all platforms and modes, with similar visual settings between the graphics modes on current-gen consoles. A few of the initial cutscenes do seem to be pre-rendered, but most of the rest appear to run in real time. 30 FPS is mostly locked here, although these sequences are beset by frame pacing issues, so they look a bit choppy and inconsistent at times. Xbox Series X and S are curiously a bit differently configured. The performance mode still targets 60 FPS, but the resolution mode now operates at 30 FPS. Performance mode operates very similarly to PS5, with combat typically pushing frame rates into the 50s, although I couldn't replicate some of the larger frame rate hitches on the Microsoft consoles. I can imagine some less discerning players may find them enjoyable, but the constant frame rate drops really hurt the experience for me. The resolution modes on Series consoles do seem to operate at 30 FPS without many performance-related dips, but poor frame pacing returns. This can present as a run of poorly paced frames, or a one-off 50 millisecond frame followed by a 16.7 millisecond frame. There are often stretches of 10 to 20 seconds between bouts of bad frame pacing, so it's not a constant irritation, but it does really hurt the responsiveness and visual consistency of the resolution modes on Microsoft's machines. So is there any way to get stable performance on current-gen consoles? Yes, but only at a severe trade-off. By running the PS4 version on PS5 under backwards compatibility and selecting the Favor Performance mode, you can get a nearly locked 60 FPS during gameplay. Unfortunately, this comes at a massive visual hit. Resolution has dropped all the way down to 720p, making the game look quite blurry and muddy. Worse still, asset quality is cut all the way down to the Series S standard. It's a hard choice to make. The cuts here are brutal, but it does at least perform at a good level. It's also worth mentioning that there's a hidden rendering mode on PS5 that also improves performance. By setting the console to 1080p output and restarting the game, you get access to a native 1080p mode. This mode appears to run the game at a straight 1080p with no signs of checkerboard rendering. Frame rates are a bit better than the performance modes, but the game still hangs in the mid to high 50s during most combat. The dips are still quite noticeable, unfortunately, and I think this mode is probably best overlooked. What about the last-gen releases on last-gen hardware? I won't go into too much detail here, but the results aren't as bad as you'd think, at least keeping current-gen performance in mind as a benchmark. PS4 and PS4 Pro consoles offer a resolution and performance toggle, while Xbox One S and X consoles have just one mode that basically functions similarly to the PS4's performance modes. Resolution unsurprisingly takes a dive on these consoles, operating anywhere between 720p and 1080p depending on the console and mode, and asset quality is similar to Series S on all last-gen machines. The enhanced consoles are actually reasonably playable. PS4 Pro holds close to 60 FPS in typical gameplay in performance mode with occasional dips, with a resolution mode that offers 30 FPS gameplay with significant dips in combat. One X offers a very consistent, solid 60 FPS update that actually feels quite good to play, by far the strongest performer of the native console versions. It looks quite similar to the Series S release, but drops frames much more rarely. It may seem odd that One X can outperform Series X and PS5, though the reduced resolution and asset quality surely help here. PS4 and One S don't fare nearly as well. Performance mode on PS4 typically hangs between 30 and 60 FPS, with frequent and hard dips during combat and traversal. Resolution mode targets 30 FPS but frequently misses it, bottoming out at around 20 FPS. One S operates similarly to PS4 in performance mode, but with a wider performance range that stretches between 20 FPS and 60 FPS. The base consoles are sort of playable, but only barely. The 60 FPS targeting modes would probably feel a fair bit better with the 30 FPS cap. Performance is not good here, but I feared even worse results coming from the current gen releases. At least the enhanced machines are reasonably functional, although asset fidelity and image quality remain somewhat dire. Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin is a technically confounding game. Visually, it's a throwback that combines reasonably detailed artwork with dated-looking rendering techniques. Some areas look a bit garish or generic, but others actually look pretty decent. Expectations should be set appropriately, but there's definitely something to appreciate, particularly in some of the more evocative interior areas. Unfortunately, the game is let down by poor image quality and performance. It's impossible to get anything near a locked 60 FPS on native current-gen code, with frequent dips during combat on all platforms. Plus, the 30 FPS modes that are available on Series X and S run with uneven frame pacing. Worse still, the Series S has inexplicably poor asset quality, with extremely low resolution textures and low poly models. It's the largest difference in visual quality I've seen between a Series S and Series X version of a game, and I suspect it's the largest we'll see for a long time. These degraded assets are also present on the last-gen console versions, which makes the prospect of running the PS4 Pro code on PS5, which is seemingly the only easy way to get genuinely good performance on current-gen consoles, much less appealing. These problems are unfortunate because the game itself has an interesting enough concept. It plays sort of like a mix between Dark Souls and a character action game like Devil May Cry, with a sprinkling of squad tactics thrown into the mix. Team Ninja knows their stuff here, and I enjoyed what I played, at least when I could overlook the game's visual and frame rate issues. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. To view a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch, just use Twitter. That's all for me for now. Thanks for watching.